Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking a really debated commentary from Glenn Beck. We're looking at a concept he's warning is a growing and dangerous political coalition here in the West. Now, whether you know this commentary inside out or this is literally your first time hearing about it, our goal today is just to map out the exact arguments, the historical parallels he draws, and those stark warnings he's issuing. So, let's dive right in.
Part 1. The premise, defining the alliance.
To really grasp this commentary, we've got to start with the foundational premise. It's a structural shift driven by what Beck calls the red-green alliance. Basically, in this framework, red represents socialist or democratic leftist movements, and green denotes Islamist political movements. Now, the central thesis here is that these two vastly different ideological groups who, frankly, want entirely different worlds, are forming a strategic alliance of convenience. Why? Well, just to secure short-term political power.
Moving on to Part 2, the paradox, a clash of core values.
So you might be wondering, how exactly does an alliance between such totally opposing worldviews actually function? Well, Beck points out a pretty stark paradox. To keep the coalition together, they loudly agree on specific domestic issues, things like healthcare, schools, wages, and fighting racism. But, and this is a big but, to prevent the alliance from totally shattering, they intentionally suppress discussions around fundamental human rights. They're basically omitting the rights of women, the LGBTQ community, and the freedom to mock religion. The argument here is that leftist leadership is actively silencing these issues just to avoid offending their Islamist allies.
And to illustrate what he sees as just, well, fatal naivety on the political left, Beck uses this really vivid fairy tale metaphor. He essentially argues that marginalized groups on the left have been convinced their biggest enemy is a domestic conservative, all while, in his words, climbing into bed with an ideology that literally wants to destroy them. It's a huge rhetorical punch, right? It's designed to highlight what he views as a massive, massive blind spot.
All right, Part 3, the evidence, the Iranian historical parallel. To prove that this modern alliance is doomed, the commentary relies heavily on a very specific historical precedent. He looks at the aftermath of the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Beck maps out this really rapid, chilling timeline showing how Islamists purged their Marxist allies once their shared revolution ended. Look at this timeline. By 1980, communists held 0 seats of power. By 1983, after they dared to criticize the Ayatollah, the mass purges began. And then, by 1988, a fatwa triggered massive prison executions. The whole argument here is that the alliance is strictly temporary. It literally only lasts until the Islamists actually hold the reins.
And you know, the crucial point he's making isn't just about the timeline, it's about the sheer brutality of it all. The commentary details the absolute devastation that befell the leftists who actually helped build the movement in the first place. We're talking over 1,000 people arrested, hitting the party leadership directly. 163 colleagues dying under torture. The first secretary forced into a televised denunciation, and over 1,000 executed and buried in unmarked graves. He presents this as a brutal historical fact, using it as a really dire warning for today.
9 years. According to Beck, despite 40 years of leftist struggle in Iran, it took only 9 years for their useful alliance with the Islamists to end in mass graves. The clock, he argues, ticks incredibly fast the second that common enemy is defeated.
That brings us to Part 4, warnings for the West, for both the left and the right.
So, applying this cautionary tale directly to modern Western politics, Beck issues these really stark warnings to both sides of the aisle. First, talking to the left, he asserts that democratic-socialists are just fatally miscalculating. He argues that the Islamists will ultimately win this power struggle because they operate with absolute conviction. They believe they are literally on a mission from God, adhering to a theology that hasn't changed for 1,000 years. As he puts it, they'll have absolutely no time for your women's movement once they're in charge.
But crucially, Beck's warning to the political right is equally urgent. He strongly cautions conservatives against cozying up to Islamists just over some superficial shared stance on family values. He draws this massive line in the sand. He's saying, look, there is a huge difference between democratic policy disagreements, like, debating marriage laws in a republic, and ideological extremism that mandates throwing people off roofs or enforcing strict Sharia law and burqas. He's practically begging conservatives not to be blinded just because they happen to share a dislike of modern progressive culture.
Which leads us to Part 5, the appeal, looking for a historical shift.
In this final segment, the commentary shifts gears. It goes from these dire warnings to a somewhat desperate appeal. Beck uses this intense metaphor of standing in the worst part of a hurricane, shouting into a wind of, quote, absolute evil, all while the public just seems completely deaf to the threat. It really sets the stage for what he believes absolutely must happen next if the Republic is going to survive.
To find a path forward, the commentary actually looks backwards, to America in 1920. The argument here is that under Woodrow Wilson, the public initially went along with progressive policies, but eventually they recognized the overreach and just decisively rejected it. Beck is expressing this deep hope that a similar political awakening is happening right now. He's hoping the broader American public will soon wake up to the current extremes and finally say, okay, we've got to get out of this.
And to trigger this awakening, Beck appeals directly to what he calls good Democrats. He actually cites Senator John Fetterman as an example, someone he vastly disagrees with on almost every policy. But he uses him to argue for a coalition built on fundamental principles. This appeal asks both sides to unite strictly on the basic rights of men, women, and families. He asks the left to accept policy disagreements without resorting to violence, to acknowledge America's past flaws but actually work to fix them, rather than, as he says, picking at the scab. He wants the focus to be entirely on preserving the country against actual extremist threats.
And that brings us to the end of this explainer. By mapping out these arguments, looking at the history of the Iranian Revolution, and hearing the modern warnings presented by Glenn Beck, we're really left with a critical question. Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, are modern political alliances of convenience blinding us to fundamental clashes in human rights? It's a really complex issue, but understanding these core arguments, that's the first step. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep asking the big questions.